Stop right there. You can't build here." The voice sliced through the crisp morning air like a chainsaw, startling a flock of sparrows from the towering pines. I froze mid-swing, my hammer hovering over a nail, as a woman in a blinding pink tracksuit charged across my land like she owned it. Her name, I'd later decide, was Karen, because no other name fit the clipboard-wielding, self-righteous fury stomping toward my half-built cabin. Sweat beaded on my forehead, not from the work, but from the sheer audacity of this stranger invading my sanctuary. I'd only been on my land for a week, but apparently that was long enough to attract the wrath of Serenity Valley's unofficial dictator. Little did she know, I wasn't just some weekend warrior with a hammer and a dream. I owned the entire valley, every acre, every tree, every pebble in the creek. This confrontation was about to get legendary. 6 months earlier, I'd made the biggest decision of my life. After a decade grinding away in a soul-sucking city job, staring at spreadsheets under fluorescent lights, I cashed out. A lucky crypto investment had turned my modest savings into a small fortune, and I poured every penny into Serenity Valley, a sprawling 500-acre paradise in the Pacific Northwest. It was my escape, my rebellion against the 925 cage. The plan? Build an off-grid cabin, live simply, and answer to no one. The land was pristine, rolling hills, dense forests, a crystal-clear creek that sang at night. No neighbors, no HOA. No rules, just me in the wilderness. So I thought. I'd spent weeks sketching the cabin in my head. Cedar walls, solar panels, a wraparound porch to watch the sun dip behind the mountains. I wasn't some amateur. I'd studied sustainable building, watched countless YouTube tutorials, and even consulted a local architect to make sure my dream was structurally sound. By day 7, I'd cleared a small plot, laid the foundation, and started framing the walls. It was hard work, but every nail I drove felt like a step toward freedom. That morning, I was up at dawn, hammering away, the smell of fresh-cut wood mixing with pine in the air. The valley was quiet until Karen showed up. She marched right up to my worksite, her sneakers kicking up dust, her face a mask of indignation. The clipboard in her hand was her weapon of choice, clutched like a knight's shield. "Do you have an idea who you're dealing with?" she barked, her voice so loud it echoed off the hills. I set down my hammer, wiped my hands on my jeans, and sized her up. She was maybe 50, with a blonde bob so perfect it looked like it was glued on. Her tracksuit screamed, "I'm important," but her eyes screamed, "I'm looking for a fight." I tried to keep it civil. "Morning," I said, offering a polite nod. "This is my land. Can I help you?" "Your land," she scoffed as if I'd just claimed the moon. "This valley is under our HOA jurisdiction, and your shack is a violation of at least a dozen regulations." I blinked, trying to process the absurdity. HOA. In the middle of nowhere. My land was 10 miles from the nearest gated community, a snooty enclave of McMansions called Crestview Estates. I'd driven past it once, big houses, bigger egos, and a gate that screamed, "Keep out." But my valley, it was private, untouched, and 100% mine, free of any HOA nonsense. I checked the deeds, hired a lawyer, dotted every I, yet here was Karen, acting like she ruled the forest. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my tone even, "I think there's a misunderstanding. This is private property. I own it. No HOA applies." Here, her eyes narrowed, and she jabbed a manicured finger at me. "Shh, don't you dare lecture me. I'm on the Crestview HOA board, and I know the rules." She flipped open her clipboard, revealing a typed list of violations with my cabin's location circled in red pen.
Eyes.
Unapproved structure, non-compliant exterior materials, failure to submit for architectural review. This is a disgrace. I glanced at my cabin, a sturdy frame of reclaimed wood blending perfectly with the trees. A disgrace was a work of love. I tried reasoning with her. "Look, I've got the deed, the permits, everything. This land isn't part of your community." But Karen wasn't listening. She was too busy scribbling notes, muttering about property values and aesthetic standards. Then came the bombshell. "I've already called the police," she said, a smug grin spreading across her face. They'll be here any minute to shut this down. You'll be lucky if they don't arrest you. Arrest me? On my own land? I couldn't help it, I laughed. Not a chuckle, but a full-on belly laugh that made her flinch. What's so funny? She demanded, her voice hitting a new octave of outrage. Ma'am, I said, catching my breath. You're about to find out why this is a bad idea. Her grin faltered, but only for a second. She squared her shoulders, ready for battle, oblivious to the fact that she'd just picked a fight with the one person who held all the cards. I leaned against my truck, sipping coffee from my thermos, and waited for the cops to arrive. This was going to be a story for the ages. Karen planted herself 10 feet from my cabin, her sneakers kicking up clouds of dust as she glared at me like I'd personally insulted her entire existence. The clipboard in her hand was her weapon of choice, and she wielded it with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no. Do you have an idea who I am? She snapped, her voice sharp enough to slice through the thickest pine. I set my hammer down on a sawhorse, wiped the sweat from my brow, and leaned against a stack of lumber, trying to keep my cool. No, ma'am, I said, keeping my tone polite but firm. But I'm guessing you're about to tell me. Karen Whitaker, Vice President of the Crestview Estates HOA, she announced, as if that title carried weight in the middle of my wilderness. Crestview Estates was a gated community 10 miles away, a cluster of overpriced McMansions with manicured lawns and pretentious gatehouses. I'd driven past it once, noting the members-only vibe and the kind of people who probably argued over mailbox colors. My land, Serenity Valley, was a world apart, 500 acres of untouched forest, rolling hills, and a creek that sparkled under the morning sun. No HOA, no covenants, just pure freedom. But Karen had other ideas. She flipped open her clipboard with a dramatic flourish, revealing a typed list of violations that looked like it had been prepared with military precision. This shack, she said, gesturing at my cabin, with disgust, is a blatant violation of HOA regulations. She rattled off her grievances like a prosecutor in a courtroom. Unapproved structure, non-compliant exterior materials, failure to submit plans for architectural review, and my personal favorite, inadequate landscaping. I glanced around at the towering pines, the wildflowers dotting the clearing, the natural beauty of the valley. Inadequate landscaping? This woman was delusional, ma'am, I said, crossing my arms. This land isn't part of your HOA. I own it outright. I've got the deed, the permits, everything. I gestured toward my truck, where a folder of legal documents sat on the passenger seat, proof of my ownership and my right to build. But Karen wasn't interested in facts. Her eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer, jabbing a manicured finger at me. Don't you dare lecture me, she hissed. I've been on the Crestview board for 5 years, and I know every rule in this county. Your little project is lowering property values for everyone in our community. I couldn't help but chuckle, which only made her face turn a deeper shade of crimson. Property values? 10 miles away? The audacity was almost impressive. Karen, I said, keeping my voice calm, my cabin's on private land. Your HOA has no jurisdiction here? But she was already on a roll, pacing back and forth, her tracksuit swishing with every step. This is an eyesore, she ranted, disgrace to the aesthetic harmony of the region. Do you know how hard we've worked to maintain standards? People like you come in here thinking you can just do whatever you want, ruining it for everyone. Sipped my coffee from a battered thermos, letting her vent. She went on for a solid 10 minutes, listing every imagined slight my cabin inflicted on her precious community. The lack of a proper driveway, the unsightly pile of lumber, the fact that I hadn't consulted her board before breaking ground. Each complaint was more absurd than the last, and I started to wonder if she'd ever set foot outside her gated bubble. The valley was raw, untamed beauty, exactly why I'd bought it. My cabin, built with reclaimed cedar and designed to blend into the landscape, was no McMansion, but it was mine. Every nail, every beam, was a step toward the life I'd dreamed of. Then came the kicker. I've already called the sheriff, Karen declared, her voice dripping with smug triumph. They'll be here any minute to shut this down, and you'll be lucky if you're not fined or worse. She crossed her arms, her clipboard tucked under one elbow, and gave me a look that said she'd already won. I raised an eyebrow, trying not to laugh again. Fined on my own land? For building a cabin I had every legal right to construct. This was getting better by the second. Karen, I said, setting my coffee down, you might want to rethink this. Her smirk faltered, but only for a moment. Rethink, she scoffed. The only one who needs to rethink is you. Once the deputies get here, you'll be packing up this mess and leaving. She turned on her heel as if to dismiss me, and started typing furiously on her phone, probably texting her HOA cronies about her impending victory. I leaned back against my truck, watching her pace, and felt a strange mix of amusement and pity. She had no idea what she was walking into. I thought back to the day I'd signed the deed, sitting in a lawyer's office as he walked me through the details of Serenity Valley. You're buying more than land, he'd said, grinning. You're buying power? He wasn't wrong.
Oh.
The valley wasn't just a pretty view. It came with control over a private access road, the only route connecting Crestview Estates to the highway. Most of the residents didn't even know it was privately owned, and I'd been content to let them use it. But Karen's little power trip was making me reconsider my generosity. I didn't say anything yet, though. I wanted to see her face. When the truth hit, as we waited for the deputies, Karen kept up her tirade, muttering about standards and people like me who didn't belong. I stayed quiet, sipping my coffee, mentally rehearsing the moment I'd hand over my deed and watch her world crumble.
Ow!
This wasn't just about a cabin anymore. It was about standing my ground, protecting my dream, and teaching a busybody a lesson she'd never forget. The low rumble of an SUV broke the tension, and I looked up to see a sheriff's vehicle pulling onto the dirt path leading to my cabin. Dust swirled as it parked near my truck, and two deputies stepped out, their boots crunching on the gravel. The older one, a grizzled man with a weathered face and a badge reading Daniels, looked like he'd seen his share of neighborhood disputes. The younger deputy, a lanky guy with a clipboard of his own, seemed more curious than confrontational. Karen, however, saw their arrival as her moment of triumph. She practically sprinted toward them, her pink tracksuit a blur, waving her clipboard like a battle flag. "Officers, thank God you're here," she exclaimed, her voice hitting a pitch that made me wince. "This man is building illegally, violating HOA regulations, and I demand you shut this down immediately." I stayed calm, leaning against my truck, my thermos of coffee warm in my hand. The deputies exchanged a glance, the kind that said they'd dealt with Karens before. Officer Daniels approached, his eyes scanning the half-built cabinets, cedar frames sturdy. It's the foundation level, the site tidy despite Karen's claims of an eyesore. "Morning," he said to me, his tone neutral, but not unfriendly. "Mind telling me what's going on here?" Before I could answer, Karen launched into her tirade, thrusting her clipboard at him. "This structure is unapproved. It's lowering property values for our entire community. He didn't submit plans, didn't get permits, didn't follow any of our rules." She pointed at me like I was a criminal caught red-handed, her face flushed with righteous fury. I raised a hand, signaling I'd wait my turn. "I've got something to show you," I said, walking to my truck and pulling a thick manila folder from the passenger seat. It contained the deed to Serenity Valley, a stack of permits, and a surveyor's map outlining my 500 acres. I handed it to Officer Daniels, who flipped through the pages, his eyebrows lifting slightly as he read. The younger deputy peered over his shoulder, jotting notes on his own clipboard. Karen, oblivious to the shift in mood, kept talking. "Crestview Estates has strict standards, and this shack is a disgrace. I'm on the HOA board, and I know the law." Officer Daniels held up a hand to quiet her, his eyes still on the deed. "Ma'am," he said, his voice calm but firm, "let me get this straight. You're saying this land falls under your HOA's jurisdiction?" Karen nodded vigorously, her blonde bob bouncing. "Absolutely. Our community has authority over this entire area to maintain aesthetic harmony." I couldn't help it, I snorted, which earned me a glare from Karen. Daniels looked up from the documents, his expression unreadable. "And you're aware this property is 10 miles from Crestview Estates?" he asked her. Karen faltered, but only for a second. "Distance doesn't matter. Our covenants extend to the surrounding region to protect property values." The younger deputy, whose badge read Carter, spoke up, his tone polite but skeptical. "Ma'am, HOAs don't typically have jurisdiction over private land outside their boundaries, especially not 10 miles out." He glanced at me, and I gave a small nod, appreciating his clarity. Daniels handed me back the folder, his face now tinged with amusement. "Sir," he said to me, "this deed checks out. You own this land outright, and your permits are in order. No HOA applies here." Turned to Karen, whose jaw tightened, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "Ma'am, there's no violation here. This is private property." Karen's face went from red to a shade I can only describe as volcanic. "That's impossible," she sputtered, stepping closer to Daniels as if sheer volume could change the facts. "I'm on the HOA board. I would know if this land wasn't under our control." Daniels raised an eyebrow, his patience clearly thinning. "Ma'am, I've got the deed right here. This valley, all 500 acres, is his. Your HOA has no authority, 10 miles outside your gates." He gestured toward my cabin. "He's got every right to build here, and from what I can see, he's doing it by the book." I couldn't resist a small smirk, which Karen caught, and it sent her into overdrive. "This is outrageous!" she shouted, turning to me. "You think you can just waltz in here and ruin our community? I'll have my lawyer sue you for devaluing our properties." Officer Carter stifled a chuckle, quickly covering it with a cough. Daniels, ever the professional, kept his face neutral, but shot me a look that said, "Good luck with this one." I shrugged, sipping my coffee, and decided it was time to let Karen dig her own grave. The deputies stepped back, clearly ready to wrap this up, but I had one more card to play, one that would make Karen regret ever setting foot on my land. Karen's threat to sue hung in the air like a storm cloud, her voice shrill as she jabbed her finger at me. "You'll regret this," she spat, her clipboard trembling in her hands. "I'll have my lawyer bury you in lawsuits. You're devaluing our entire community with this shanty." The deputies, Daniels and Carter, stood by, their faces a mix of amusement and exasperation. I could tell they were ready to wrap this up and get back to their coffee. But Karen's tirade was a runaway train, and I was about to derail it. I took a slow sip from my thermos, letting her words echo into the quiet valley, then stepped forward, my boots crunching on the gravel. It was time to drop the bombshell that would flip this entire confrontation on its head. "Karen," he said, my voice calm, but carrying the weight of someone who knows they're holding all the cards. "You might want to hold off on calling that lawyer." She froze, her eyes narrowing, clearly not used to being challenged. "What are you talking about?" she snapped, her tone dripping with disdain. I glanced at the deputies, who were now watching with keen interest, and continued. "See, I don't just own this plot where my cabin's going up. I own the entire valley, all 500 acres of it." I paused, letting that sink in, then delivered the knockout punch, including the access road your Crestview Estates uses to get to the highway. The silence that followed was deafening. Karen's jaw dropped, her clipboard slipping slightly in her grip as her eyes widened to the size of dinner plates. The deputies exchanged a glance, and I caught a faint smirk on Carter's face, like he was enjoying the show. "Ah!" Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, struggling to process what I'd just said. That's impossible," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You can't own the road. It's public property." I shook my head, pulling the surveyor's map from my folder and unfolding it for all to see. The map clearly outlines Serenity Valley's boundaries, with a bold line marking the private access road that snaked from Crestview's gates to the main highway, a road deeded to me when I bought the valley. "See this?" said, pointing to the map. "This road's been private since the valley was first parceled out decades ago. Most of your neighbors probably don't even know it, but I've got the title right here." I tapped the deed in my folder for emphasis. "I've been letting Crestview use it out of courtesy, but if you keep pushing this, I might have to reconsider that arrangement." Karen's face went from red to ghostly white, her smug confidence evaporating like morning mist. The deputies leaned in to glance at the map, and Daniels let out a low whistle. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "That's a new one." Karen tried to rally, her voice shaking as she clutched her clipboard like a lifeline. "You're bluffing. You can't just close a road. We have rights." But her bravado was crumbling, and I could see the gears turning in her head as she realized the implications. That road was Crestview's lifeline. Without it, their fancy gated community was cut off from the highway, forcing residents to take a winding 20-mile detour through back roads to get anywhere. It was the kind of inconvenience that could tank their precious property values faster than my shanty ever could. I didn't want to be that githa one who plays hardball over a road butt. Karen's relentless crusade was testing my patience. "Karen," I said, folding the map and tucking it back into the folder, "I don't want trouble. I just want to build my cabin and live in peace. But if you keep coming after me, I'll have to talk to my lawyer about that road." I let the threat hang there, unspoken but clear. The deputies were now openly grinning, and Carter scribbled something on his clipboard, probably just to look busy. Karen's eyes darted between me, the deputies, and the map, her mind clearly racing for a comeback. "This isn't over."
Act.
She finally sputtered, but her voice lacked conviction. She took a step back, her sneakers scuffing the dirt, and I knew I'd hit the mark. Daniels cleared his throat, breaking the tension. "Ma'am," he said to Karen, "I'd suggest you take this up with your HOA board before you escalate things. Further, this man's within his rights, and you're on his property." He turned to me, tipping his hat slightly. "You're good here, sir. Let us know if you need us again." Carter nodded, adding, "Try to keep the peace, folks." The deputies headed back to their SUV, leaving Karen standing there, deflated, her clipboard now limp at her side. I gave her a small nod, not gloating but not backing down either. The ball was in her court, and she knew it. The deputies' SUV kicked up a final cloud of dust as they drove off, leaving Karen standing alone in the clearing. Her pink tracksuit a stark contrast to the muted greens and browns of Serenity Valley. Her clipboard, once brandished like a sword, now hung limply at her side, as if it had lost all its power. Officer Daniels' parting words echoed in my mind. "Ma'am, I'd suggest you take this up with your HOA board before you escalate things further." Karen's face was a mix of shock and humiliation, her earlier bravado reduced to a faint stammer as she muttered, "This isn't over." But the tremble in her voice told a different story. She knew she'd lost this round, and I could see the realization dawning that she'd picked a fight with the wrong guy. I gave her a small nod, not gloating, but firm, and watched as she shuffled back to her shiny SUV, parked haphazardly on my land. The engine roared to life, and she peeled out, leaving a trail of gravel and her pride in the dust. I stood there for a moment, sipping the last of my coffee, the quiet of the valley settling back in. The birds returned, their chirps filling the air, and I couldn't help but smile. This was my land, my dream, and no clipboard-wielding Karen was going to take that away. But the story didn't end with her retreat. Word of the confrontation spread like wildfire through Crestview Estates, carried by the gossip network that thrives in places like that. By the next week, I received a carefully worded email from the HOA president, not Karen, but a guy named Richard, who probably spent his days dreading her boardroom rants. The email was a masterpiece of diplomacy, apologizing for the misunderstanding and expressing a desire to work together to preserve the beauty of the region. Translation: they were terrified I'd make good on my implied threat too. Close the access road. I had no intention of doing that, of course. Shutting down the road would have been petty, and I hadn't bought Serenity Valley to play the villain. The road was a small strip of gravel, barely noticeable on the map. But it was the only direct route from Crestview's gates to the highway. Without it, the residents faced a 20-mile detour through winding back roads, a hassle that could make their McMansions a lot less appealing. My lawyer had pointed out the road's significance when I bought the valley, chuckling as he said, "You're not just buying land, you're buying leverage." At the time, I'd shrugged it off, thinking I'd never need to use it. But Karen's stunt had reminded me of the power I held, and while I didn't want to wield it, the threat alone was enough to keep Crestview in check. Over the next few months, I threw myself into finishing the cabin. Every day brought progress. I installed solar panels to power the lights, set up a rainwater collection system for water, and built a wraparound porch where I could sit and watch the sun sink behind the mountains. The valley became my sanctuary. Each nail I drove a declaration of independence. The cabin wasn't fancy, no granite countertops or smart thermostats, but it was mine. It's built with my hands, designed to blend into the landscape. The cedar walls glowed in the evening light, and the creek's gentle hum lulled me to sleep. At night, this was the life I'd dreamed of, and no HOA could touch it. Karen, meanwhile, became a ghost of her former self. I'd see her SUV occasionally, cruising slowly along the access road, her pink tracksuit visible through the tinted windows. She never stopped, never waved, just glared as she passed. I'd sit on my porch, coffee in hand, and give her a friendly wave, knowing it drove her nuts. The rest of Crestview seemed to have gotten the memo, though. Few residents even stopped by to introduce themselves, offering awkward smiles and compliments on the cabin. "Looks sturdy," one guy said, eyeing the cedar beams. "Sorry about Karen, she gets intense." I nodded, keeping things civil, but I could tell they were all a little nervous about the road. I let them sweat it out, never mentioning it unless they brought it up. By the time the cabin was done, Serenity Valley felt like home. I'd built something real, something lasting, and the victory over Karen was just the cherry on top. The story of her defeat became a local legend, retold with laughter at the nearby diner where I'd grab breakfast on supply runs. "You're the guy who took down the HOA lady," the waitress said once, sliding an extra pancake onto my plate. I just grinned and tipped her extra. Life was good. If you're watching this, dreaming of your own escape, let this be a lesson. Check your deeds, know your rights, and don't let a Karen with a clipboard steal your peace. Hit that subscribe button, share this story with your friends, and drop your own HOA horror stories in the comments. I know you've got Till next time, keep living free, and I'll see you from my porch in Serenity Valley.